Hello, and welcome to Ipsa Dixit, a podcast on legal scholarship. I'm your host, Brian L. Fry, Spears Gilbert Associate Professor of Law at the University of Kentucky College of Law. I'm joined by a co-host, Guy Hamilton Smith, Legal Fellow at the Mitchell Hamline School of Law, Sex Offense Litigation and Policy Center. Our guest is Joshua Kleinfeld, Professor of Law at Northwestern University Pritzker School of Law. We will discuss his article, Two Cultures of Punishment, which was published in the Stanford Law Review. So welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. It's great to be here with both of you.
Yeah, it's great to be here. And I'm so happy to be getting to talk to you about this article. Just as a bit of background, Brian introduced it to me several months ago, and ever since then, it's just really made a pretty profound impact on how I think about punishment and sort of the work that I do. So, Professor Kleinfeld, can we start with just sort of like an overview of the paper? Of the sort of, there are a lot of big ideas, but just kind of where it sort of takes us.
Sure. Briefly, it starts with what I call the Great Divergence. The Great Divergence is the incredible difference between European criminal punishment and American criminal punishment. American criminal punishment is, as is well known, harsher than European. It turns out that it's harsher not just from European punishment, but also from America's own past. And so there's been a historical shift emerging in the late 1970s and early 1980s and continuing through today, where America was a mild country from a criminal punishment perspective for 2 centuries. Then it changed. And in changing, diverged profoundly both from its past and from Europe. That's the motivation for the analysis. That's where we start from. It's trying to understand why we changed and what the change represents. And from there, I try to develop certain larger ideas about criminal punishment and its cultural significance.
So when talking about the Great Divergence, you mentioned the 1970s as to where America and European ideas about criminal punishment really began to sort of separate, and also from our prior mildness. What do you think accounts for that divergence in that time frame?
That's the question of what caused the change. And it's a hard question to answer. There are, one of the things I discovered in researching this and writing it is just how difficult it is. There are about a dozen explanations in the academic literature, ranging from Europe learning the lessons of fascism to America racism, basically a reconstituted form of Jim Crow laws leading to harsh punishment, to differences between the American and European welfare states, to differences between American religiosity and European secularism. At a certain point, I concluded that the Great Divergence is like a Rorschach blot. People see in it what they want to see. There are a dozen or more explanations, all of which have some evidentiary basis. I don't mean to say otherwise, but none of which can be proven. So I think I just want to acknowledge at the outset how very, very difficult it is to account for this phenomenon. My own view is that America experienced a massive crime wave in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, and to some extent 90s, though it sort of crested and declined at that point. And there were 2 responses to the massive crime wave. One was an instrumentalist response, which said, we have to get control of crime by deterring and, above all, incapacitating criminals. So the crime problem was a criminal's problem, and the solution was to cage criminals. The other was a moralistic response, which said these criminals are evil and deserve to be condemned. And a toxic combination of moralism and instrumentalism gave rise to the Great Divergence.
And you talk about in the paper concepts of individualism and evil as sort of being fulcrums around which the Great Divide sort of rotate, with America being, of course, a very individualistic country with this belief in evil, whereas that belief not really being very widespread in Europe. And I was wondering if you could explain, I guess, more about the role of those sort of beliefs in sort of creating this divergence.
You know, when I drafted I wrote this paper twice. The first time I wrote it, and it was about the concept of evil, and it was entitled "The Concept of Evil in American Criminal Punishment." I ultimately abandoned that title and that focus, that exclusive focus, because I came to think it was not the whole truth, that instrumentalism, the desire to get control of criminals by any means without regard to moral considerations, was just as important a factor in American criminal punishment as the concept of evil. So I didn't want to focus exclusively on it, but to not focus exclusively on it is not to say it's a non-factor. It is a factor. Mm-hmm. I had an interesting experience in this regard. I like to go on police ride-alongs and interact with prison wardens and prison guards, police officers, and criminal defense lawyers and prosecutors in both Germany and America. I lived in Germany for a while, and in both countries, I would ask the people I was interacting with, what proportion of the criminal offenders that you interact with would you characterize as evil? I just asked it like that. I didn't define evil, didn't offer a definition, just a direct question of moral character. In Europe, the question is met with silence or uncomfortable giggles, or most often the question, what do you mean by evil? In America, everyone says about 10%. There's no question about what evil means. They just say about 10%. I think that indicates some of the cultural difference over that concept.
And is that a pretty? My background is sort of a little bit in criminal defense, and like people have asked me that same question, like what percentage of clients that you've worked with would you say are evil? And that's actually my response as well. Is roughly about 10%. So
is that right?
Yeah. So do you find that that's a pretty consistent response that you get from Americans when you talk about these issues?
I say it as an anecdote. I haven't done a scientific study and
sure.
This, but yeah, what I mean by the anecdote is I don't think Americans are troubled by the concept of evil in the way Europeans are. I think there's something about our culture of moralism, maybe our religious history, that makes the concept of evil sort of relevant for criminal purposes. The more common European understanding is that crime is a sociological problem or a psychological problem, a condition, maybe a medical condition in need of treatment. I think American culture is more comfortable with a moral understanding of crime and punishment.
And that's sort of how when you talked about the crime wave, you wrote in the paper that America kind of reached into its bin of tools to try to make sense of what was happening and what to do about it. And we came up with the concept of, I believe you wrote something like, we came up with the concept of evil and the concept of a cage. And so that's how we then proceeded to address the problem.
That's right. And I don't want to diminish the cage part of that answer. There are two pieces to the American puzzle. There are a bunch of practically minded, not particularly moralistic people who are concerned with getting control of the crime wave. And they said, they asked themselves whether rehabilitation works. They could find little evidence that it does. Lacking a rehabilitative solution, they said the solution is incapacitation, and they turned to a cage for pragmatic reasons, to control crime by controlling criminals. Essentially an incapacitative pattern of utilitarian thought. On the other hand, there was a community of people who had a more moralized, I don't want to call it moralistic, that sounds like I'm criticizing it, just a moralized perspective on crime, who saw in the crime wave a sort of flood of destructive human evil and thought it needed to be condemned and responded to with retributive condemnation. What they agreed about was that the crime problem is a criminal's problem, and the solution is to cage criminals. So I think there were two intersecting movements that by the way, they were associated with different populations. The instrumental, utilitarian, pragmatic, incapacitative response was common among criminal justice professionals. The moralized, condemnatory response focused on human evil was common among the voting public. And again, the combination of those two forces was the author of our, in my opinion, the author of our punitive response to crime.
Well, in talking about our punitive response to crime, you also, and perhaps this would be helpful to talk about, to, I guess, give some more texture to what we're talking about exactly when we're talking about this divergence. But, you know, reading through the paper, you talk at several points about sort of the treatment of prisoners and reentry policies in Europe that are, you know, to my sort of American sounding ears, were very, very, very foreign, to, I guess, forgive the pun. And I'm wondering if you might be able to talk a little bit about, like, just sort of how far apart America and Europe appear to be when it comes to how we treat prisoners and how we sort of regard re-entry, which is to say when people who've committed crimes are done with their sentence, they're supposed to re-enter society.
So now we're getting into the meat, the factual meat of the Great Divergence itself. It is so remarkable how different America and Europe have become, and indeed how different America has been from itself. The most famous thing, and if you don't mind, I'm going to, I'll talk about prisoner reintegration, but a few other topics as well that I think speak to the issue. The most famous aspect of the difference is capital punishment. Europe has banned capital punishment individually in its various member states. I'm focused here on continental Europe and the European Union, but also as a matter of treaty throughout the European Union. And they regard capital punishment as a sort of crime of the state of the first order. The United States federal constitution has been interpreted to allow capital punishment, and many of our states either allow it de jure formally or actually practice it. But that's not all. Europe has also banned the sentence of life in prison without parole. And again, that's both pan-European via the European Court of Human Rights, but it's also true of many European member states, like Germany, for example. Europe has substantially reduced what I call stage of life sentences. So, for example, in Germany, the most severe sentence available for any crime or combination of crimes or set of crimes, even repeat offenses, is 15 years unless you commit murder, whereas you can get life with parole. But those 15-year sentences are exceedingly rare, and the life in prison, even with parole, is exceedingly rare. Out of a country of some 80 million, there are only 2,700 people who are serving prison sentences above 10 years. That is to say, 2,700 people in the entire country are going to prison for 10 years or more. We have 87,000 just in our federal prisons, which represent just about 10% of all our prisoners. Mm-hmm. And now, finally, to get to your question, which was about prisoner reentry, there are just remarkable differences. Prison conditions are different. Focusing now on a particular member state, Germany, which is the most populous of Europe's countries. One of the first things that happens when you go to prison is you get a job. you get a job with normal, with vacation time, paid leave. You're not deprived of your right to vote. In fact, one of the first visitors you get is a voting counselor who teaches you how to vote. You have substantial rights to privacy within your prison cell. For example, it's legally required that guards knock before they enter. And you have substantial rights not to have your crime publicized, so that when you leave the prison, the facts of your crime remain private. To say the least, there are no sex offender registries, but it goes beyond that. There was a movie being made about one offender's crime, a famous crime of terrorism, and the offender sued from in prison, saying that the movie would publicize his crime, and in publicizing it, interfere with his reintegration once he was released from prison. And the court upheld the restriction and prohibited the movie.
And this is, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. Please go on.
That's okay. I was just going to mention one other difference, which I think is the most astonishing of all to American ears, which is that criminal offenders upon release have the right to have their record of their crimes destroyed with the police, including their fingerprints. They can have their fingerprints removed from the database.
That is, I mean, when I first read the article, that was the item that just totally just blew my mind and made me, I think that fact alone really puts into great relief the distance with which we sort of in America and Europe regard sort of the role of prisoner reentry.
And it's not just harshness, right? Of course, these punishments, these prison conditions and policies on reintegration, they do show America to be harsher, but it's more than that, isn't it? When you say to prisoners, we're going to destroy your file, including your fingerprints, you're saying we accept you back into the community as a full citizen. We don't regard you as a potential threat or a future criminal, someone who needs to be monitored, controlled, surveilled. We simply regard you as a member of the flock who is temporarily excluded and now is being welcomed back into the fold. And the American policy of depriving ex-cons of their right to vote, of their right to serve on juries, allowing employers to inquire or requiring offenders to disclose the fact of their previous offenses, maintaining their fingerprints. What we're saying, in effect, is we're not just being punitive. What we're saying, in effect, is we regard you as a permanent risk of criminality.
Right. That the person isn't, that they're just not convicted of a crime, but that they are a criminal. That, you talk in the paper about that we look beyond the act to the actor and impute onto them we read onto them sort of that they are, I mean, not just that the act that they committed was a crime, but that they become devalued by nature and by virtue of the act that they sort of commit. And so that distinction between sort of act and actor and the difference with which sort of Europe and America approaches it, I think, is also just one of the most illuminating aspects of the paper to me. That people are welcomed back into the community as whole members of society, as I think you also mentioned that we used to do in America. And of course, that is so strange to us now. Do you see a way to, maybe perhaps balance, find more of a balance between the two kind of approaches? Or do you see things just continuing to sort of escalate?
I think what would be, I may sound like I'm just an unmitigated fan of the European approach. That isn't true. The European approach is milder in ways that are healthy sometimes, but it also denies individual responsibility and the existence of human evil in ways that really trouble me. There's also some evidence to the effect that Europe struggles to get adequate control over its very worst offenders. It's really determined repeat criminals. So I think neither system is entirely admirable. The American system is recklessly brutal and treats people as permanent criminals whose lives in fact can be salvaged. The European system is naive and responsibility denying. I think what we need to learn is how to be American with respect to a sliver of criminals and European with respect to the vast majority remaining. So that answer you gave, about 10%, that answer I hear from so many Americans when asked the question, how many criminal offenders would you say are evil? What that answer implies is that 90% are not. 90% are just human beings whose lives have become disordered or who have some important shortcoming, but one that does not kind of immutably mark them as a criminal. With that in mind, I think that what we need to learn is how to be European with respect to the 90% and American with respect to the 10.
And so one of the things that you talk about in terms of what Europe and what European, sort of the philosophy that underlies the European approach is sort of an immutable redemption, that, people are always sort of capable of being redeemed. And you talk about this within the context of Germany, and of course Germany's history with the Holocaust and the Third Reich. And it occurs to me that, do you think that a society that is so sort of wed to the belief of immutable redemption, that a person can always be redeemed from their criminal acts, is a society that has sort of need of that belief themselves?
So I lived in Germany for about 3 years, and I wondered, why is a society that has itself committed such unspeakably evil acts, why does it insist so vigorously on denying human evil? Why would the home of Nazi Germany be also the place that denies the existence of human evil? It's troubling, right? And it's puzzling as well. What I came to see was that the evil that Germany engaged in was committed by my friends' grandparents. And it is psychologically impossible for an entire people to hate itself, hate its history. To be evil is to be hateful, and it's not something a culture to hate itself is not something a culture collectively can maintain. Individuals can, but not a culture collectively. So I think that Germany denies the existence of human evil in part because they stand in such great need of forgiveness themselves. They have to believe evil is mutable, that redemption is possible, because their cultural history is one of seeking redemption.
So then in that context, I guess it occurs to me, America seems to have a lot of blood on its hands, in terms of slavery, the Civil War, Jim Crow, legacy of racism and leading into mass incarceration. I mean, it's not, I don't think anything is quite comparable to the Holocaust, but we've certainly done a lot of pretty terrible things as a country, and also the extermination and relocation of indigenous populations. So it seems to me the similar thing could be said about America, and I guess I wonder, with that sort of in mind, how do you reconcile, or is it possible to reconcile that we certainly don't have that belief in America?
I sometimes wonder why, when America experienced a huge crime wave, it took such an individualistic response. I mean, why didn't the country experience this huge crime wave and think something is wrong with our society such that we are seeing a tenfold increase in crime? But it doesn't seem to be in our country's cultural DNA to be self-condemnatory. You see that with academics. I suppose you see that with the American left, but you don't see on a large, popular sort of voting scale serious self-questioning and self-condemnation. And maybe that's why we can so ardently embrace the idea of human evil and take such a condemnatory stance to criminals without seeing, as you put it eloquently, the blood on our own hands.
And so why do you think that, and this, not to be too far afield, but why do you think that is, that we're sort of repulsed by the idea of any kind of real self-reflection or self-criticism?
I don't know that I have a great insight about this. Individualism might be one factor. There are these surveys of European and American attitudes about large-scale kind of moral questions. For example, the Pew Research Center annually surveys German attitudes to individual responsibility and American attitudes, as well as French and Spanish. If you ask survey respondents, do you think success in life is pretty much determined by forces outside your own control? 72% of Germans will say yes. 57% of French people will say yes. 50% of Spanish people will say yes. And only 36% of Americans will say yes. And that has been the single most constant difference between American and European attitudes over the decades that the Pew Research Center has done this annual poll. It could just be that in a highly individualistic country, explanations on a social scale of these cultural phenomena are uncommon or are found unacceptable. Maybe they sound like excuses.
Mm-hmm. And so it could just be a product of sort of our individualistic culture that's sort of almost baked into our DNA, in other words.
The American belief in personal responsibility is one of the most extreme, measurable differences between American and European values. So, and it seems to me that a strong belief in individual responsibility is in tension with the kind of collective wrongdoing that you're pointing to with indigenous populations and Black Americans and others.
And so I guess in kind of threading or sort of dovetailing with sort of the notion of like the things in our past and our history that we've sort of yet to reckon with, there was one line in your article that really stuck out to me and struck me and sort of resonated in terms of the work that I do, particularly with respect to sex offense registries, which you mentioned a couple points in the paper. But the line is that every society, like every person, has monsters in its closet, nightmares that it has trouble not thinking about, and those fears teach us something about the culture. And so there's a bit of a wind up here, but to the question, and that's that, even within sort of the extremes of American punishment, there are sort of few areas that are as extreme as what we do to individuals who are convicted of some sort of a sex offense. And it occurs to me that that's sort of the proverbial monster in our collective closet. And so I would be, given my own work, and how much I've enjoyed your paper, I would be remiss if I didn't ask, how do you see the connection between the ideas and the philosophical underpinnings in your paper with respect to American extremes in punishment, and then even the state of exception or the sort of hyper extremes that we go to punish people convicted of sex offenses in particular? In other words, how do you see sort of sex and sexuality and sexual harms sort of also playing a role in these kind of ideas? Because as you said, America is, Europe doesn't have sex offense registries like America does. I mean, I believe America is the only country in the world that operates them in such a broad and draconian fashion. So like I said, I would be remiss if I didn't ask what your thoughts are.
Sure. In a way, the differences between European and American treatment of sex offenses is a symbol of the whole Great Divergence. One of the things that kind of troubles Americans when they encounter mild European punishment is how mild it is with regard to sex offenses. So generally in Germany, the sentence for sexual compulsion by force but without penetration will be 1 year or 6 months. The 6 months for, quote, less serious cases.
Right.
And the minimum sentence for sexual compulsion by force and with penetration is generally 2 years. Only where the sexual compulsion involves a weapon or serious bodily injury does the minimum rise above the mark of 3 years. Furthermore, many of those short sentences are suspended. That is to say that Europe isn't just mild with regard to, say, drug crimes. Actually, Europe is pretty severe with regard to drug crimes. Europe is mild with regard to the things that most upset and offend us, things like violent rape and child sex abuse.
Yeah, because the 6 month suspended sentence was the sentence that was given to the Stanford student Brock Turner, who and the sort of outcry over his case led to the recall of Judge Aaron Persky. So, and you're saying that a similar offense in Germany would lead to, would certainly be within the norm of a sentence given in Germany. Is that right?
They're routine. Yeah, those sorts of short sentences for violent sexual assault are routine.
And so, I mean, you say that this is sort of, that this is, I forget the word that you used, but sort of emblematic of the Great Divergence is our sort of approach to how we deal with sex offenses. But, even within American sort of culture, it's sort of on this pedestal of punishment that we, people aren't, judges aren't recalled, for example, over, short sentences for drug offenses or even violent offenses, but it's, in particular with respect to sex offenses. Do you see any role for, I guess, the concepts of individualism and evil, for example, as being sort of the driving forces behind this kind of state of exception?
Absolutely. I think here's why I thought the sex offender issues that are, part of your research are so emblematic of the Great Divergence. It was with regard to, let's take an instrumental approach to sex offenses, and then let's take a moralized approach, see how those two perspectives work together. A lot of research came out in the 1970s when America was getting deeply alarmed about crime, and in the 1980s, about how criminal offenders could not be rehabilitated. And the most widely publicized of that research had to do with sex offenders. The basic conclusion is that people's sexual desires are immutable features of themselves. They cannot be controlled, and sex offenders will just continue to prey on others. And so America's kind of instrumentalism, its approach to controlling sex offenders by caging them, emerged in that period of time. Meanwhile, on the moralized side, the view of sex offenders is that they prey upon the weak. And so if there's one group of people who most horrify us with their evil, it's the sex offenders who prey on children. And so now you can see how these two perspectives cooperate. You have on the one hand a group of people who are seen as impossible to rehabilitate, as permanent offenders. And then you have another group of people who see these as the worst of the worst because they commit their crime on the most vulnerable. So the one perspective is saying they are perpetually dangerous. They're not just dangerous sometimes, they're dangerous beings, a kind of dangerous creature. And the other side is saying they are immutably criminal, they are evil. And those two sides cooperate on a solution. It's a solution of very, very lengthy and sometimes permanent sentences, civil detention, and sex offender registries that form a sort of network of surveillance and control of sex offenders for their entire lives.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned civil commitment. I noticed in the paper that European countries have a type of civil commitment process, but that it seems to work significantly different than the American version. Am I understanding it correctly that people who are sort of, I guess, detained as sort of quote unquote dangers have a sort of a right to have their sentence reviewed, and after a certain period of time, there's a presumption that they are to be released?
That's right. So what we do in America is 3 strikes, right? We when somebody commits 3 offenses, they're subject to a life sentence. We also have a lot of other techniques for monitoring and controlling recidivism. When, for example, our federal sentencing guidelines are an XY graph. On the X-axis is the seriousness of the offense in question. On the Y-axis is the seriousness of the offender's criminal history. Mm-hmm. And the intersection of those 2 points determines the sentence. It's a graph. One whole axis is devoted to the offender's criminal history. What Europe does is the German approach is what it calls the frame approach, like a window frame or a picture frame, where for a given offense, there's a sentencing range considered proportional to that offense. And no matter how many times you have committed the offense, you can never go above that frame. So let's say, for example, that the frame for armed robbery is 1 to 5 years in Germany. If you commit a single armed robbery, it's very likely your first sentence would be at the minimum of that frame, 1 year. If you commit your 20th armed robbery, you can still never be sentenced above 5 years.
And again, to American ears, that is just so astonishing. But I guess, and that also, to loop back around to what you said earlier about being sort of dissatisfied with, both the European model. In your view, does the European sort of approach to criminal justice doesn't account for sort of the serious, violent, incorrigible offenders? Is that an accurate kind of characterization?
That's right. That's my view. I should say something which, at the risk of being, inaccurate, I have to mention something else. Germany, in particular, does have something which it calls which is the equivalent of civil commitment of repeat violent offenders. It sounds like an exception. In fact, it's the exception that proves the rule. It's designed for the criminally insane, drug addicts, and chronic recidivists. That is to say that people who commit criminal offenses many, many times are grouped conceptually with the mentally ill, not with other criminal offenders. And they have a right to treatment and to resocialization while held. And they have a right to regular review of their sentences. Above all, very, very few people are actually held, are actually civilly detained under that law. Just a few hundred out of a country of, again, 82 million. So I say that to admit that Germany does have, and Europe in general, do have some punitive criminal tools to deal with repeat offenses, but they use them rarely, and they treat them as non-condemnatory in character. They treat them as a medical approach.
Mm-hmm. And so you said that their use is far more, I guess, because in America we have roughly between 5,000 and 6,000 people in civil commitment facilities throughout the United States, but their use is far more limited in Germany. Is that right?
Yeah, right now in Germany there are 491 people who are civilly committed. Again, it's a country of over 80 million.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Actually, and in the 1990s, it was 2-digit. It was 97 people held in civil commitment. So that is to say, Germany reserves this possibility of treating someone as a repeat violent offender and holding them permanently, subject to constant review, but holding them permanently. But it only does it with a few hundred people.
So, and I mean, given that it's such a, well, I guess the one of the questions that I definitely want to ask you is there's this notion that you have of leveling up versus leveling down. That
Not my idea, Jim Whitman's idea.
Yes, the notion that Europeans level up, and there's you gave an example in the article of French politicians trying to one up one another to see who could be more humane to prisoners, which I think would draw chuckles from American listeners because that's pretty much the opposite of what we generally see in America, where politicians want to punish criminals just worse than the last politician who spoke. And so I guess to sort of wrap up, the question that the question that I really want to sort of know is how do you see a path for us to kind of maybe reframe some of our punitive impulses to this notion of leveling up versus our sort of standard response whenever we're sort of confronted with an injustice of leveling down. Do you see that there's a way for America to do that, or is it just sort of kind of in our DNA?
I think it's emphatically not in our DNA. In this particular interview, we haven't talked very much about America's past. We've talked a lot about the European-American division, which can make it sound very essential, as if Europe was always mild and America was always harsh, and these are permanent facts about the country. Nothing could be further from the truth. In the era in which America was founded, the era of the Enlightenment, it was widely believed that democracies would be mild in criminal punishment, that democratic government would sort of pull penal mildness in its wake. There were good theoretical reasons to believe it, and for many years it appeared to be true. So immediately after America's founding, in the 1780s, there was a great wave of criminal justice reform in America. Prisons were originally developed as places of penance. There's a nuance there, but prisons were thought of as places of penance. That's why they were called penitentiaries. There was a huge effort during the late 18th and early 19th century in America to eliminate the penalty of capital punishment. It was largely successful. The reason murder is today divided into degrees, first and second degree, is that the capital punishment opponents, while they were unable to eliminate capital punishment, were able to reserve it for the very worst kinds of murder, first degree murder. So they invented the distinction as a way of limiting capital punishment. When Tocqueville, came to America and wrote Democracy in America, he had funding from the French government to study America's experiments in penal mildness and prison reform. And in addition to Democracy in America, he wrote a book about how humane punishment is in a democratic society like the United States. America's rate of sentences was fairly low and stable and equal to Europe throughout most of the 20th century. So from the 1920s through the 1970s, about 1 in 1,000 American adults were incarcerated, which is the same as Europe today. In fact, 1979 saw one of the lowest incarceration rates in all of American history, or American modern history, American 20th century history. At its peak in 2007, 1 in 31 adults was under some form of correctional control, either probation, parole, or incarceration. 1 in 1,000 to 1 in 31. What I mean to say is a lot of what America needs to do is return to its own past. We are not genetically punitive. Democracies are not genetically punitive. Europe was quite harsh. Torture was routine until their countries started to democratize, and then democracy did indeed pull penal mildness in its train. What we see in America is a kind of harshness that seems inevitable today only because our historical view seems to extend to the 1980s and not before. But there were a good 200 years from the 1780s to the 1980s in which we were a world leader in terms of punitive experimentation, or I should say penal experimentation and mildness. So part of what we need to do is return to the past. I think there's two other features of it, and indeed features of our past that we can return to. One is that a moralistic response to crime, a response that emphasizes individual responsibility and condemnation, does not have to be an unforgiving one. In a moral perspective on crime, there's a potential for condemnation, for views of the criminal as evil, but there's also the potential for forgiveness and mercy, for seeing the criminal. I use religious language, although I myself am not religious, for seeing the criminal as someone made in the image of God. If we can draw upon those aspects of our moralized traditions, not only to condemn, but also to forgive, not only to see criminality as mutable, but also to see the criminal as a child of God, then we can start to temper the condemnatory character of our own punishment. And indeed, that is consistent with America's past. America's religious forces were huge elements in earlier efforts to abolish capital punishment and otherwise keep criminal punishment mild. In other words, American religion wasn't always punitive. It was once a force for mildness. I also think that the practical instrumentalists who above all want to control crime are short-sighted in the way they think about costs and benefits when they're excessively punitive. You know, when you imprison someone for 30 or 40 years, what happens to that person's children who are now fatherless and angry and resentful of the society that did this to their father? If you do a cost-benefit analysis where you're just focused on whether one particular offender is likely to or able to commit another offense, then it seems like the way to control crime is to lock people up and throw away the key. Mm-hmm. But when you focus on whether, on the ripple effects of imprisoning that person on his family and community and the wider society, a true, inclusive, comprehensive cost-benefits analysis will suggest that we should be more careful about how harshly we punish and who we punish harshly. And we should be just considerably more nuanced about imposing those costs. So what I'm trying to say is that there are three sources of a better future for American punishment. One is to attend to our own past. One is to think more carefully about comprehensive costs and benefits. And one is to think about the potential for mercy and forgiveness in our religious and moral traditions.
And so you said that we had, you wrote that we had a crime crisis and created a punishment crisis. And through, sort of taking that prescription, do you think that that would then lead to the sort of third path? That we've obviously become much too punitive and Europe is perhaps too naive. So do you think then that sort of third path then becomes possible by factoring in what you were just talking about?
Yeah, if I had to put it in a single sentence, I would say crime is supposed to be antisocial, punishment should be pro-social. We need a pro-social principle of punishment, a pro-social approach to punishment. A pro-social approach to punishment is one that tries to preserve the offender's membership in the community wherever possible, to take seriously the costs of imprisonment as well as the costs of crime, and that tries, to the extent it can be maintained, to treat the offender as someone who is errant and not lost, not evil. A pro-social, the kind of slogan version of my three paths to a better future, the return to the past, the comprehensive costs and benefits, and the moralized forgiveness. The one sentence version or slogan version is a principle of pro-social punishment.
I like it. A principle of pro-social punishment. I just want to say again, thank you so much for agreeing to take the time to speak with me. I've been I've just been really excited about your paper ever since I read it, and so I'm really glad to finally have gotten the chance to speak with you about it.
Well, Guy, thank you for these really probing and thoughtful questions and for taking the work seriously. And Brian, thank you as well for welcoming me onto this podcast. You know, as a scholar, you write these pieces and labor over them. This one I labored over for years. I wrote it and thought I was wrong and abandoned it and started from scratch. I changed my thesis and changed my argument. I labored over individual sentences because it felt so important to get it right. And then you put it out there in the world and you wonder, did anyone read this? It's so long. It's so difficult. Would anybody care? And you two are caring. So I appreciate it very much.
Thank you.
Yeah. Pleasure was all ours. And thank you so much, Josh.
We've one passage of a tough new law raising criminal fines 25%. It'll turn up $4 million to train more and better police officers, and it won't cost the taxpayers one single penny. We're fighting for ways to help citizens cut the cost of crime prevention. Ideas like subsidizing alarm systems for merchants and a neighborhood security program, and to protect the lives of police and the public. I've led the fight for gun control, to get the small pistol out of the hands of the criminals.